Good evening. Hello. I'm Carol Burns. I'm the head of creative writing at the University of Southampton and the host of Writers in Conversation, our reading series that is sponsored by the university in association with Nuffield Theatre. I am very happy and thrilled to have with us tonight Tessa Hadley. I came to know Tessa's work in the way that many Americans have come to know Tessa's work, and that is through her short stories in The New Yorker. She's been a frequent contributor to that prestigious magazine for many years, and I've always enjoyed the stories and the sort of beauty of their language and the subtlety of their insights. And Tessa was born in Bristol, studied English literature at Cambridge. Her father, I found out today doing a little research, was a jazz trumpeter and her mother an artist.
He was actually a school teacher, but he's a wonderful, still is a wonderful trumpeter, but it wasn't his profession. That makes it a little more glamorous than it sounds.
That sounds like publishing marketing truths then, right? And she had 3 children before enrolling in an MA in creative writing at Bath Spa, where she also earned a PhD studying Henry James. And I believe the book, Henry James and the Imagination of Pleasure, does that come out of your PhD?
Yeah.
Yes. And then she published her first book, Accidents from the Home. She has since published 2 short story collections and 5 more novels, most recently The Past, which she'll be reading from tonight. The Guardian recently said in their review of The Past that Tessa, in her patient, unobtrusive, and almost self-effacing way, Tessa Hadley has become one of the country's great contemporary novelists. So we're very lucky to have her here tonight. Thank you, Tessa.
Not really that self-effacing, but there we are. What a funny thing to say. I think it means I haven't won any prizes. I actually do think it means that, but it wasn't voluntary. Lovely to be here, and thank you for coming out on a rather cold evening when the temptations of being on the sofa and watching the telly must have been quite powerful. Does anybody watch the telly anymore? That's such an old-fashioned thing to say, isn't it? Anyway, never mind. So I think I'm going to start by reading a little bit from my new novel. Then Carol's going to ask me some questions which will prompt us to talk about writing and novels and short stories, whatever crops up. I'll read a little bit more and then we'll ask all of you whether you have any questions you'd like to ask as well. Does that sound about right?
Perfect.
Okay. This is quite a difficult novel to pick bits from to read, isn't it funny? Some novels, you don't know this when you write them and when you publish them until you start reading them. You don't know that some lend themselves to little extracts and little bits of reading which work perfectly and seem to just be easy. Because this is a very tight, entangled novel with quite a big cast of characters all meshed in together and interrelating, it's quite difficult to pick the right bits, and I've found a couple of bits that work, and I'm a bit tired of reading those, so I'm going to try something different this evening. Basically, the novel I'd written before was called Clever Girl, and it was the story of one life covering about 50 years of her life, or at least bringing her up to the age of 50. She was a woman born in the same year as me, in Bristol like me, but leading a life very unlike mine, but I sort of felt this lovely relationship to my invented character as if she was, I don't know, not a doppelganger, because most definitely braver and more exciting than I'd ever been. But anyway, she was some kind of twin. I had a reaction to that of wanting with my next novel to do the opposite thing, not a great 50-year stretch told in bright, sharp, sort of hot episodes, but instead a concentrated 3 weeks. I thought, I'm going to write a whole novel and it will only cover 3 weeks and all my characters will be in one place and they won't move. I think literally in Clever Girl, each chapter, which sort of worked as an episode, was set in a new place, which seemed right for a long mobile life, but I wanted the opposite quality here. Actually, what happened as I wrote my 3-week novel of concentrated time was that at a certain point, I don't know, did I lose my nerve or did I just... No, I think I had a good instinctive feeling that something wasn't quite right with that form. So at a certain point when I'd written quite a lot of the novel, I changed my mind, and actually, at not a midpoint, a bit beyond a midpoint, I suddenly drop out of the present, which is sort of now. I think I set it in 2012, actually. And I drop out of that 3-week holiday, and I drop back 35 years, and I go back into the past. And I'm happy that I do that. So what I might read is I'll read a little bit from the present of the novel, and then at the end I'll pick up a little bit from the past section. So the present of the novel is set in the west of England, in the countryside, and it's in a lovely house that's entirely of my imagination, where 4 siblings in their 40s have gathered for 3 weeks, and it's their holiday house, I suppose, but it's very meaningful for them. It belonged to their grandparents. Their father was the vicar there, and their mother brought them there on significant occasions all through their childhood. It's rich with memories for them. Their mother, who died young, she died when they were teenagers, so her absence is potent in the novel. That's what I thought at first. I thought that's all she would be, just this eloquent absence that in the end you gradually realise everything refers to her being missing. And then when I decided to do my middle bit, I kind of thought, why am I avoiding this character who has a sort of depth and a charge to her? I think I need to take her head on, and I did, and I actually do. I describe Jill, who is their mother, and I describe her, of course, as if once we drop back into the past, we have no idea that she's going to die young. So the way a novel can play with dramatic irony and have that power up its sleeve that just fills up the sentences without being explicitly there. So I assemble my cast in the countryside for 3 weeks. So they're going to decide whether they're going to keep the house or get rid of it. So there's the 4 siblings. Alice comes with her ex-boyfriend's son, who is a 20-year-old, who is a student, disaffected, bored, wondering what he's doing there, doesn't even like the countryside. Roland comes with his 16-year-old daughter Molly, who is a sort of fascinating blank in a way. We don't know what she's going to be or what she is, and those two, that's one of the strands of my story, is an attraction growing between those two. And then Fran, the third of the 4 siblings, brings her 2 children, Ivy and Arthur, and this scene is Molly and Kazim, the teenagers, and the kids who go on an expedition into the countryside. Kaz and Molly are just, how shall I say, circling each other. Nothing's happened between them yet. Kazim had acquired a map from the study. He led them to the waterfall a different way, through a tunnel where a railway line had once passed overhead, then across a stretch of high scrubland. The waterfall, when they eventually arrived, was a disappointment. In Ivy's anticipation, it had tumbled in a crystal stream foaming into the pool below. In reality, it was a swelling silver rope in a long curtain of vividly green moss. There was no authoritative thunder of falling water, only a subdued trickling. Because she'd talked it up as the climax of their walk, she felt humiliated. Kazim and Molly hardly looked at it. Molly flopped down in the grass and closed her eyes as if she was sunbathing. Kazim sat nearby and began reading a book which he took out of the back pocket of his shorts. They appeared to have forgotten each other entirely. Then Ivy noticed that while Kazim frowned seriously into the pages of his book, he was at the same time tickling Molly's bare midriff with a long piece of grass. He did it so casually that at first Molly didn't know it was him and brushed the grass seed head away carelessly without opening her eyes. When the tickling persisted, as if the grass had a will of its own, nothing to do with Kazim, a smile of knowing came on Molly's face, and still without opening her eyes, she snatched at the seed head and held on to it, crushing it. Kazim's face showed nothing. Excluded, Ivy was suddenly shy and wanted to do something childish. She went to paddle in the pool with Arthur. Water babbled in there secretively. A freckled yellow light, refracted in the tea-coloured depths, gilded a scatter of pebbles on the sandy bottom. Insects sculled the surface, dodging into the darkness under the ferns. The water was vivid against Ivy's legs as socks of cold. They were wearing their jelly shoes. It didn't matter if you got them wet and you were safe from glass. Arthur was sternly preoccupied in some game with a thermos cup, pouring water out of the pool in a cleft in the rock. Ivy pressed her palms against the soaking moss of the waterfall until she thought there might be slugs and pulled her hand away smartly. Then she was seized by the sensation of seeing herself from a far distance, from the skinny tops of the fir trees stirring high above the clearing, miniature, alone inside herself, cut off at the knees by water. Kazim picked another stem of grass and dusted its drooping, plumy head, heavy with seeds, against Molly's cheeks and her closed, protuberant mauve eyelids. With her hair fallen back from her face, he thought, and from his odd angle she looked quite different, a sleek water animal basking on a rock. "What are you doing?" she said. "Don't! It tickles." He had forgotten Molly herself. He was so intent upon his explorations of her ear now, which stood out childishly from her head, its cartilage golden pink and transparent. Trailing his grass around the walls of it, he speculated aloud that the grass stem might be sharp enough to pierce its long lobe. Then he prodded at it. Molly squealed in protest and sat up. Both of them were shocked, looking one another in the eye again after such intimate contact. "Why don't you pierce your ears?" Kazim asked severely. "Or your nose, or at least something." She explained that she would love to wear earrings, but she had a horror of the pain of piercing. In fact, she couldn't bear the idea of any pain. She told him this solemnly, with innocent self-importance, as if she were telling him she disliked Marmite or classical music. "I've never even had to have a filling at the dentist, thank goodness." "Ever been stung by a bee or a wasp?" She shuddered at the idea. "Never. I hate them." "Broken your arm?" "No. I sprained my ankle once. That was bad enough." "Got a staple in your finger from a staple gun?" "Oh, God," she buried her face in her hands. "No, did you ever do that?" She believes she's charmed, Kazim thought incredulously. She thinks she gets a choice. She thinks it's something special about her and that she's discriminating against pain out of an especially refined sensitivity, as if other people are made differently and don't mind it. "Ever had a Chinese burn?" he said slyly. "What's that?" "We used to do them in the playground at junior school. Give me your arm." "I don't want one." "Give it to me." He held her arm above the wrist in his two fists, then twisted them opposite ways, pulling the skin lightly but hard enough to hurt her and make her pull away, only half laughing. She rubbed at the place where he'd left a red mark, easy tears welling like lenses, magnifying her tawny irises. "What about childbirth?" he said. "Don't you want children?" "You can have an anaesthetic," Molly said, "from the waist down. My mother did, and she said it was fine."
Thank you. you're reading that passage, made me, of course, think of an entirely unscripted question. And that was, first of all, the flirtation between Molly and Kazim is so well done all the way through. I mean, they're sort of not really acknowledging each other and not acknowledging their flirting and all of that. Is that, how did you go about doing that, and how did it come to mind? And
I think that's easy, isn't it? Really? We all know about that stuff, probably. How did it? I do these blank girls, only they never are blank, and Molly really does turn out not to be blank. She keeps sort of offering this very, almost staggeringly ignorant and unalerted surface to his probing. But I think what one feels as that goes on is that it's real, it's her, but there's so much behind it, and it's a kind of strategy. It's a good strategy for holding off the dangerousness of a young man like him. He's quite dangerous, not because he means to be, but because he's angry and doesn't know how to be, and especially doesn't know how to be with girls. So I don't know, that cocktail of teenage experience. Yeah. If anything's ever easy to write, I suspect it's teenagers and love and sex. It's so heady and so complicated, and everybody's been there to some extent. Yeah. So of all the things, that's not challenging, I have to say. Oh no, it's just fun. Yeah. It's fun in a sense.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me about the past, while the and I held up the book cover because it seemed apropos for this reason, is that while the people are always changing and their situations changing, and the time in the novel changes, there's the place is really constant. So I was wondering if that was something you had in mind as well.
Well, I mean, there's two ways in which that matters, isn't there? First of all, formally for the novel, that was in a way my device, that was the setting, the stage that held the thing, this slightly imagined house that maybe I vaguely had a house in the back of my mind that I'd never been inside, that I've glimpsed, but mainly I just made it up. But I wanted it to become very powerful. I mean, houses and novels go perfectly together. Houses don't need to be turned into a metaphor, they just are one. We live in them, we fill them up with our marks, with our possessions, with our stuff, with our history. Stuff happens in them, and then time moves on, and that thing is held. I mean, in every way, a house in which 3 different generations of a family have all lived. How could you fail to turn that into something potent? That sense that this happens in a room, then time passes, and then that happens in it, and those people sleep in it, and time passes, and then these other people sleep in it. So the house was, it was a controlling metaphor or something like that in the book. And then literally, for this family, it's operating as some kind of repository of value for them, because they're all in middle age, and they're, like we all are, meandering and not quite sure what they're doing with themselves, or what they are, or what they've got, or what they want. But there is this constant, this repository of something valuable to them, which is terribly English. I mean, I'm absolutely sure other cultures have their own version of it, but my version is a very English version. The sense that you live in the city, but somewhere your value, or something about your history, or something really spiritually precious to you, is invested in a dream of the countryside that I've deliberately got them all doing that. None of them live there. They actually don't want to live there, but nonetheless it's some kind of dream that matters to them. I mean, I hope I'm a little bit, not at all sending that up, but I think I'm quite relieved when they decide to sell it. It's a bit of a spoiler. They decide to. It's not a spoiler. You know that's going to happen from the beginning. At the end, I'm not satirical about that bit of English culture and English life, but there it is. It's a funny business, this living in cities and having this yearning for some green, serene otherness, pastoral, that isn't very real, and nobody knows how to live there. I mean, some people do know how to live there, but not those city folks.
I was quite surprised when they decided to sell it.
Okay, sorry, well, I have spoiled it.
So, in fact, I thought about asking you about that, and then, oh no, I don't want to do a spoiler, but now we can discuss it.
Now I've spoiled it anyway.
No, it's not spoiled. And then, of course, there's the other place there, the little cottage, where all sorts of things, at least two couples have sex there, and then all, not to be spoilers, all sorts of things happen there.
And those two couples don't know, neither of them knows about the other one. That's a lovely, there's talking about the ways you can have, if you have a family over a period of long time in one place, you can have those dramatic ironies. The novelist and the reader knows that those two coming together, those two pairings off, both happen in the same place. Nobody in the novel knows that. That's just a bit of the fun of the way novels work, isn't it? That we can know things about the characters by having our godlike overview that they will never know about themselves.
Yeah. It's a place of secrets, that little cottage, because the kids have their little secrets. Because the kids often, they go out, and while Molly and Kazim, is that how you say his name, sort of are flirting, they sneak into this half-demolished cottage and discover things and don't tell the grown-ups.
Yeah.
Which is...
It is an important charge. But I think when I first thought of the book, what I had was the house, which is so potent in the family mythology, and then I had a summer house or something like that in the garden, but I gradually realised I needed it to be further away, more private, more prone to hosting secrets, so it became a cottage that's a little bit of a walk away in the woods, in fact. Yeah. In which more can happen somehow than if it was too much in view of the house.
Yes, people have their secret lives.
Yeah, people have their secret lives and they go there.
Yeah. Another thing that struck me reading the novel is just how many characters that you get us into the heads of, and how adeptly you do that.
Well, it's something I really like in writing, which is slightly, I mean, of course, there are plenty of novelists doing it, but it's not the default position at the moment. The default position at the moment tends to be to have either one character through whom, whether in the first person or the third, most of the consciousness is refracted. That one character is your interpreter. Or maybe one character in one section and another character in another section, another character in another section. These are all time-honoured and can be, wonderful ways of writing a novel. That's sort of my last novel, Clever Girl, was all through the first-person narrative of Stella, of my Bristol doppelganger. But I wanted to do something really unlike in this one, and I like that rather old-fashioned thing of being inside one character's head in one sentence and then shifting to another character's head in the next and another character shortly afterwards. And in the end, of course, there's no reason why not. You are God. If you want to pretend that it's all coming through one character's head, that's absolutely fine, but it's only your choice. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to be inside a whole succession of your character's thoughts, or even sometimes floating somewhere above all of them and watching them in a way that none of them are watching themselves. But it is interesting that there are some characters I don't go inside. I hardly do the little boy, and I'm not quite sure why that should be so, but it seemed important to me that Arthur, Ivy carries a very large part of the narrative, just as she did there. Her little girl awareness is very important. But he is mostly, we see him from the outside, but much more significantly, the brother Roland, Molly's father, comes with his third wife, a new wife. None of the family have met her before, and she's a disruptive, sort of exciting injection of otherness in the book. And it was very important not to go inside her head. All of her power comes from being mysterious, being unreadable, actually not being interpretable. They're all watching her and listening to her and trying to work out who she is and what she thinks and what she's doing there. So it would have absolutely broken that spell to have written her from inside. And never mind the fact that I don't think I could. I was in the position of my characters. I was watching her and seeing her and studying her, but actually I don't think I had it in me to render her inner life. That was mysterious to me as well. And there's a character, at least one or two or three characters in a novel that you wouldn't dream of offering to give the flow of experience inside their head and their reading of it and their interpretation of it. That person is closed. And very often that person who's closed can be immensely effective inside your novel. They will be a sort of like a battery with power in it to alter other characters and alter other people. But part of their power depends on not having access to what their thoughts are.
When a character comes to life for you, are they sometimes based on people you know or people you've seen, or what are the various ways in which that can happen for you?
I seem to just make them up, but if I'm completely truthful, sometimes when I'm feeling for them and trying to catch them in action and get the sort of the principle of them onto the page so that they're alive, so that they're visible and tangible, I sometimes borrow a little bit from somebody alive, or perhaps even a more guilty confession. Sometimes it helps me to get something from somebody in a book. I sometimes think, oh, she reminds me of so-and-so in that book. She's my Dostoevsky character, or something like that. And so one needs a little bit of a help, a little bit of a clue sometimes to round the character out. That seems to vary from character to character. Some of them come very fully formed, noisy and complex and full, and you don't need any help. And others are more recalcitrant. They're always the ones that you dread, in a way, the ones in the pattern. They're necessary, but you don't quite believe in yourself doing them, so you have to think really, really hard about their physical presence on the page, how they talk, how they sound, what they do. And you utilise all sorts of magpie scraps that you've stolen from here and there, some of it from life. But I don't tend to do people that anybody recognises and thinks, oh my God, that's me. I do have a niece who's got something of that resistant quality of Molly, and I've kind of used her a couple of times, but she isn't really like that. But something of that withholding and that sort of, my niece certainly does take 2 hours in the bathroom in the morning and then come out looking as if she'd just washed her face. So you think, what was she working on in there? Yeah. So maybe I stole that a little bit from her.
Do you want to read a bit from the past?
Yeah, okay, so in the middle of the book, we've been living with these middle-aged siblings, 4 of them, and gradually we pick up, not in any big momentous way, it's all happened long ago, but we pick up this sadness that their mother died when they were teenagers. That's all. It's not, there's no hidden secret or anything like that. Well, actually there is a hidden secret, but they don't even know there's a hidden secret, so that's fine. And then in the middle of the book, we drop back into a time before any of that sad stuff happened, when Jill, their mother, flies from her husband, who is kind of hopeless, sexy, attractive, unreliable, and actually he's in Paris and it's May 1968 and he's supposed to be a journalist reporting on it, but he's getting carried away with everything's going to be different, the world's going to change, nothing's ever going to be the same again as it was. And she is in a kind of white heat of rage at him, leaving her behind with her 3 children. The 4th isn't yet born or even thought of. And she sort of flies from London and back to her parents in the same house that we've been in 2012. So we've gone back to 1968. And it was funny doing that. One of the funny things was my grown-up characters, who I was treating with respect as grown-ups, are suddenly little children. And Alice is sleeping in a cot with nappies. It was. I felt just a little uncomfortable at first, and I actually had to give them slightly different names, nicknames. So Alice is called Ali, and Harriet, the oldest of the 4 siblings, is called Hetty. And anyway, the bit I'm going to read, it's the children, and it's Hetty, the oldest of the 4, waking up for the first night in the country. Of course, she's used to being there. They come down for holidays and things, but essentially her life's in London. So this isn't home. She's uneasy. It was absolutely dark in the bedroom the 3 children shared. Yet in Hetty, lying in bed with her eyes strained open onto nothing, every sense was anxiously alert to the difference from home. Even the dark was different. In Marylebone, a street lamp diffused its orange glow into their room so that she could always make out the hump of Rowley in his bed. He slept bottom up with his face in the pillow, and the bars of the baby's cot casting a weak shadow on the wall. There, the headlights of cars passing crossed the ceiling in a deliciously, mysteriously purposeful, slow arc. The night was always full of voices from the London street below. Darkness in Kington was as dense as a hand clapped over her face, and her grandmother's cool sheets smelled disconcertingly of lavender. At home, Jill hardly had time to wash their sheets, let alone iron them, and Hetty had grown used to burrowing each night into the crumpled cloth, smelling of herself, her dribble and biscuit crumbs and salty hair. Something barked away in the woods. A fox? Or a wolf? There was so much empty silence in the country that each sound seemed significant in ways Hetty couldn't learn to understand. Her dad didn't understand them either. Jill knew the names of all the flowers and could recognise the birds by their songs. When Tom said he didn't care, Hetty was reprieved and hid away the I Spy books of the countryside, which were the record of her shame, hardly ticked at all. She preferred the wild animals in London's zoo, safe behind bars and identified straightforwardly by the labels on their cages, which she was beginning to be able to read. For a while she lay tormented and sorry for herself, needing to pee, disappointed in her body as she had been on the bus when she knew she would be sick. Eventually, swinging her legs from under the blanket, she slid down the side of the bed until her feet touched the bare boards of the floor, feeling with her toes for the rug. It occurred to her in a clutch of terror that in this darkness, reality could be making and unmaking itself dizzily, unforeseen precipices opening ahead of her which were not there when she got into bed. Cautiously she felt her way around by the wall. Ali stirred in the cot when she knocked against it and made lip-smacking noises. At least Hetty could discern, once she was out from the bedroom, in a dim light escaping from wherever the grown-ups were talking downstairs, the looming perspectival shapes of so many doors, open and closed, to so many rooms fearfully unused, full with their emptiness. A blue-black sky showed in the uncurtained arched windows at either end of the landing. In the bathroom, she peed and rubbed the hard toilet paper between her hands as her mother had showed her till it was soft enough to use, then pulled the momentous long chain. On the windowsill, ends of old soap were dissolving in a jam jar of gloopy water. Her grandfather used these to wash his hair. It was one of the funny stories Daddy told about his meanness. Coming out onto the landing again, Hetty was quite blind after the light in the bathroom. Tiptoeing along the landing, she didn't want to climb back into her reproachful lavender bed. In her mother's room, the curtains weren't drawn across and the window was pulled open a few inches, letting in the shock of ripe night air as cold as water. By touch, Hetty identified the familiar, loved items unpacked onto the dressing table: hairbrush, face cream, scent bottle. A little lamp with a short chrome neck offered an irresistible upright press switch in its base. She pressed, and the room sprang into satisfying being with her mother's library book, Margaret Drabble, and its postcard marker, and her mother's spare shoes, and the coat in her mother's shape on its hanger. Hetty breathed l'air du temps on her fingers and longed to slip for warmth into the weightless space between the pink satin eiderdown and the top blanket. It was so perfect when she tried it that she closed her eyes in bliss. Jill woke her later, coming to bed and cross. In the country, when you put on the light at night, she said, you must make sure the windows are closed first. Look at all the bugs that have come in. Hetty thought guiltily that she must still be dreaming. The walls of the room were crowded with blundering moth shadows looming and receding. I lost my way. I came in your room by mistake. It's too dark here at night. Her mother was implacable about returning her to her own bed. You're my big girl, Hetty. You have to be sensible.
It was really fun seeing the adults as children, actually. It was really, they're sort of like their adult selves and a little bit not, but yeah.
Yes, I was careful not to. Hetty is very, very responsible in her adult self and very anxious and rather repressed or withdrawn. But I deliberately didn't make her quite that child. Because I don't think anything is so straightforward in how we grow up from being the children we are to being the adults we become.
What was interesting was their mother was different than the person I was sort of expecting. And I suppose it's partly people mythologize someone like that.
And they only know her as children. They don't really know what it was like being inside her. Mm-hmm. They don't know the half of it. That's right. And all of those are the, when you set up any story in a novel, you have this stuff you can exploit, and so much comes out of people misreading each other. That's very rich, isn't it? You set up these bereaved, middle-aged children with their dream of what their mother was, but how exciting then to go back and write the real woman who gave rise to that dreaming. And you know, it isn't a trick. She really is powerful and important, but she isn't what they make of her now.
Yeah.
And that's kind of sad too.
Did she surprise you then when you wrote that section?
Yeah, I'm not sure I had I wasn't, you're never, when you embark on the first sentences of making somebody alive, you don't have that person encompassed and ready and waiting. It's as the sentences unroll that the person comes to life. I had some ideas about her. I had some sense of her force, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah.
But it's as you get things like, she's wearing a miniskirt because it is 1968, and she's taken up the hem with her own stitches. Those are the funny, where does that come from? I don't even know. And the stitches are rather big and clumsy. Mm-hmm. And it's when you get something like that from God knows where, that the person sharpens. And it's funny, that's when you know. And I said something as well about her. When she looked down, she has rather big eyelids, big eyes and big eyelids. And when she looks down, she looks like a Madonna. But when she looks up, that isn't what's in her eyes. And those are the things, and I really don't know where that stuff comes from, which as you put them down, they build the person, and then she's there for you, and you can lean on that, and more comes.
Yeah. That's a good writing day when you come up with just one of those details, I think. Questions from the audience. Are you guys ready? I'll let you warm up as I ask you about your short stories, which I adore. And how different a process is that for you than writing a novel?
Very different, because if you're writing a novel, you probably spend 2 years living with it, so it's a huge, momentous undertaking when you begin. You've got to be much more prepared, I think, and I don't really mean prepared by research or anything like that. I just mean you've got to have spent more time, and you've got to have more things ready to write, more of a sense of what you might be working towards here, and then where it might go there, even if all that can be overturned as you work. But it's a much more responsible business. There's something deliciously free about writing a short story. Partly it is just practical, because you actually, not so much is at stake in what you're giving to it in terms of time and your life, so you can play. It feels more playful. But, you know, of course, as soon as you're writing it, it has to have the integrity of the parts working organically together. And it has its own puzzles. But it feels like a deliciously irresponsible thing. And as long as your essential turn of the story or something feels true and good, there's so much more that you can just throw. You throw into it, you throw out, and you don't need to follow up on it. It's follow-up that is the great difference from the novel. And of course that's one of the things that's lovely about writing a novel, is you put something down and you'll dwell with it, and you'll pick it up again, and then you'll work it again, and it'll persist and it'll accumulate value or force or complexity. But a story is different. You throw the one thing down and it just burns brightly, and then you move on.
Yeah. Audience questions, yes.
I just finished reading the past novel. It was absolutely wonderful. I was very struck by the imagery and the symbolism, which was just so beautiful. I kept reading it again and again, and I wondered how easily it fell on the page, or was it a matter of an enormous amount of reworking?
Actually, I'm a really slow writer, and I don't do that thing of writing down a thin first draft and then going back in and thickening it up. I just write it really slowly, and it is quite dense when it comes out first time round. That doesn't mean, of course, there is reworking. Though mostly that's in terms of, what's it in terms of? It's in terms of cutting out what turns out to be too long, too clumsy, extraneous, getting it down to a core, rather than fiddling with the sentences and words themselves. So the reworking will usually be cutting back, and also maybe putting, in this one certainly, there was a scene I put in at some point. The first part of the novel felt too without drama. So I put in a dramatic scene. And that lifted it in a certain place where it was just feeling as if everything was happening, then another thing, then another thing, then another thing, and it needed a bit of a hill in the middle of that plain. But in terms of it's so interesting you say, I'm not even sure that I quite know what the imagery is. I certainly wasn't aware of mining any sort of symbolic schema or anything like that. So that's coming first time round, just straight out, because it feels indispensable to telling the truth about the place and the crowd of people that I've shoved in there, which is how I think imagery does work, really. It isn't an add-on. It isn't something you sort of you put in like spice at the end of this is a hopeless metaphor, but I will persist with it. It's kind of like when you do Indian cooking and you have to fry those spices are right in it from the beginning. They are part of the essence and the heart of the dish. That isn't a very good analogy, but it'll do for the moment.
I think it works. Was the scene where Alice starts to read Roland's letters? Is that the...
Oh, that is very well spotted. It is. I didn't have that in there first by the time I got to the end, and then I felt it was too flat. Actually, I'm slightly dissimulating here. I don't know why I'm lying about it. My publisher, my wonderful American publisher, just whose instincts I, not infallibly, but almost always they're right. She said, just needs a little bit more of something here.
Everyone's getting along too well.
Yeah, everyone's getting along too well, which is a little bit my weakness. Yeah, so I needed a nasty scene.
Other questions? Yes.
What do you look for in a short story?
Do you mean when I'm reading other people's short stories? That's a good question. And this is going to sound really a funny thing to ask for, but because I've judged in my time, like everybody has, all writers have, some short story competitions. And one thing I realised was missing when I was reading stories in which it was missing, sometimes stories don't have a point. And I don't mean like a clever, twisty, Roald Dahl twist at the end or anything like that, but you sort of think, well, that was quite sensitive, but what did it say? This is a really hard thing, because I really don't mean a sort of moralising judgment, but some sense that the writer needs to tell this story because it's got something in it that matters, that needs to be put out there. It has a discovery to make, I suppose, although again, it's not a mechanical thing. It's not like, oh my goodness, now I get it. It's not that. But if you think about all the good stories that one loves, they are held in a sort of tension of revealing themselves. And sometimes stories don't. Sometimes people's stories just feel, that was nice. But, so that's just one thing. Intensity, I'm sure, intensity. That's the nature of the short form should be that in its shortness it's kind of burning and red hot. Although having said that, of course, one doesn't mean that a novel is allowed to be lukewarm and slack or anything, because really, ideally, a novel should... It needs more slow time than a story necessarily does. So there's some wonderful short story writers write stories that are so meandering and complex that they have their slower phases as well. I'm thinking of Alice Munro, whose short stories are not very... They're so unlike most short stories.
They're like novels.
Sort of, but then they're not.
Yes, exactly.
They're mysterious.
Other questions?
So I do that.
Have you ever written something and you've got to a point where you think, I don't want to write this anymore, you don't feel the story?
Yeah.
How do you go from that? Do you stop writing that one and go on to another one, or...?
I think I'm a bit dogged, so I don't do that. I know lots of really great writers do. They have things on the go and they put it away. But there's something, I'm that sort of person who can't, if I'm reading a book, I kind of have to finish it, even if that means reading it really quickly and looking at the end. But, so I actually either finish something or I will drop it. Not very often, but I have. I mean, catastrophically, it's awful if it happens to a novel. Weirdly, has it happened in a short story? I think in a short story, I've usually, even when I haven't been very happy, because a story's short, I've gone on to finish it, to try and hope. You still go on hoping against hope that you're wrong, because that's the hardest question when you're a writer, isn't it? Well, there are many hard questions, but the hardest question of self-critique is to distinguish between the authentic intuition that this isn't working, it's wrong, something's wrong, it's finished, and the common feeling you have, even when you are doing something that will turn out to be all right, that you are disenchanted with it, it isn't working. And how do you tell the difference between the real it isn't working and the one that is just we're all subject to? So that's a really hard one, and you're trying to get outside yourself and outside your own head and your own involvement and look impartially, and actually you really do need to try that all the time, but it's also unattainable. So I had one novel certainly that I got a long way with halfway through, and I had a night when I was talking to a friend and I was sort of saying what it was about, and I suddenly thought, I was driving home from her house, a long drive in the dark, and it came to me with this sort of clarity that it was nonsense. I was faking it. I should stop. And I knew that, and I didn't touch it again. But that's a huge deal. I probably spent a year on it. That's quite a long time ago. And then with The London Train, which was the novel before Clever Girl, I wrote a long novel and felt all right about it, actually. Then showed it to one friend, who was a lovely friend, and he was so kind, and he sort of said, yes, it's got a lot of interesting stuff in it, and something like that. And as he said those words, it came to me that it was the dreariest, most horrible, saggy. I knew, it was so funny, it was as if I was waiting to know it, and I'd held off, and as he said those rather kind, effortful words, trying to... So that knew there was something catastrophically wrong, and I actually asked for help at that point. And again, this same wonderful American publisher who has once or twice given me advice that wasn't right, and I knew, but on this occasion she read it, and she said, well, I think, what about turning it into a novella? And I instantly knew she was right, and I did that. I started again with a new document, but I was cutting and pasting stuff, but everything was different. The whole tension of the thing was different and better. I immediately knew it was better, and I did it quickly because I had so much material I was taking out of the previous version. And then that was a novella, and then as I got on with it and thought, I think this is working now, I was casting around thinking, a novella, who wants that? How will I ever publish that? She sort of said, well, we'll put some stories with it. But then I thought, what if I wrote another novella, a twin? And what if I packed the two twins in together? And then, what if I made a secret connection between them that was like a tunnel connecting the two stories? I got, for weeks of agony of having written a no-good novel, I had a couple of hours of very pure brilliance where I solved it. Well, I didn't. She helped me. She got me started, but where I thought of that novel in two halves with the connecting link. Yeah, you win some and you lose some, but it's very, very difficult. One shouldn't always trust oneself. Sometimes it's just a horrible day and your mind is scrambled and you don't trust, you don't believe yourself, you don't believe you have the authority to write, and so you look at the page and it looks unspeakable, it looks dead, and you're wrong. But sometimes you're right, and I don't know how one manages. You just fumble it, ask someone else, look again, wait till you feel better.
So is that the advice that you'd give to someone else if they were in the same situation?
It wasn't very helpful advice, was it? But I mean, that's all I could do, yeah. I mean, if it was a student, I would look at it and I would give that kind of advice, and hope I was right. But it's so different looking from outside. You can never be that reader to yourself. And yet, I honestly believe that so much of your work has to be trying to be that reader of yourself. All the time, trying to look at it as if you hadn't just written it. Trying to see, is it tight enough? Does it flow enough? Is it getting boring? What should happen now? You should be trying to do that, but there is some last inch that you can never do in terms of detachment. But that doesn't mean that the trying to train yourself to read your own work as a reader isn't almost the most important thing. Almost.
One more question? I always have questions. If you guys don't, I'm going to give you another moment to... Yes,
there's a question.
Rebecca.
I really noticed how you were using light in the past. Could you say something about, or say a little bit more about how you thought about light in the novel?
I always do. I'm not in a very meaningful way, but in a practical way. I'm always worrying about light, sometimes almost neurotically, and I realise when I go back through that I've over-explained that it was dark, but then she put... So exactly that bit with Hattie on the landing that I've just written. It is an easy mistake to make, isn't it? That you say to everybody, you tell your reader that everything's dark, and then you say, and his brow was rather furrowed, and he had, grey-black hair, and the alert reader will think, oh, how could you see that? So I don't know why I'm hyper-conscious of that. And I don't know that I did make great play of light and dark, and I've put those two arched windows, you might have noticed, I mentioned them. They're quite important features of the house. Have a little secret hunch that goes back to play school, if anybody can remember play school. Through the arched window was always the one I loved, where I wanted them to go. So is that why in my wish fulfillment I've put these two arched windows at the end of the landing, because I find that so beautiful. I wanted to give the house a kind of beauty, and therefore, they're uncurtained and the light is significant as it comes through. But I'm not sure I'm very articulate about light. I'm very aware that that's one of the things. I mean, obviously a novel can't manage light like a stage play or a painting or a film. It's clumsy with light compared to those media. And yet it does seem to me that it still can have the emotional resonance, and it can underline the emotional content of a scene or the psychological interactions in a really precious way that's really worth having on the page. There was when the weather changes halfway through, or two-thirds of the way through the modern part, the 2012 part of the novel, where it's been very, very bright, and then it absolutely changes in the way an English summer can and becomes terribly rainy. And I was trying to capture how that everything sort of contracts, and it looks as if there's only that much light outside all the windows, whereas everything's been open before. And that's sort of, obviously, as the novel moves to its climax, that's kind of what's happening among these people as they draw closer in sometimes slightly disastrous ways, sometimes not disastrous.
All right, well, thank you so much, Tessa.